So the talk of this session is, or this talk is called Northern Ireland's Problem with Suicides. The more I learn, the less I know, and the rationale for that conclusion will become clear, hopefully at the end. The subtitle of the talk is Data Science. And data science is obviously at the heart of what MQ Mental Health does, and obviously core to the newly founded DataMind. But the order for the words, I think, is important, because before you get to the science, you have to look at the data. And that is probably the take-home message here for the discussion here today. And before I continue, maybe I should extend an apology to Aideen, who has to follow this talk for reasons which will become apparent later on. Okay, so what do we know about mental health in the population? It's actually quite tricky compared to a lot of other assessments of health conditions. Mental health is harder to get a really tight handle on. My background is in epidemiology and in public health, and this is a very standard approach that we would take to looking at ill health in the population. And in general, this sort of pyramid here tells you that, you know, all the way from deaths down to disease in the general population. And deaths are fairly definitive. They're thankfully very small numbers, relatively small numbers, but definitive. And the data generally around deaths is considered quite good. Once you get down to the more common and arguably less severe aspects of disease in the general population, our understanding of that is a little less certain. And as Iona has suggested, many people with poor mental health in the population do not attend their GP, even fewer go to hospital, and thankfully fewer end up dead. So when you're talking about the general population, you're very inclusive, you're much more sensitive to picking up the disease, but oftentimes you're less definitive in what you can say about that. Deaths, you're trading off smaller numbers, but you've got an increased specificity generally of what you're talking about. And the same would be true of suicides. So in general, this sort of balancing act between smaller, more specific numbers and classifications with a greater, more sensitive and inclusive, but perhaps less specific understanding of disease in the general population. Suicide statistics, of course, are a very common, very well understood source of statistics, and they have a lot of strengths. They cover all of the population. It's a requirement that deaths are registered and cause of death is registered and has been for centuries, and it covers the whole population. And because it has this long tradition and legal requirement, these data go back decades, which means you've got longitudinality, which means that you can then pick up changes and trends and identify when increases of deaths are related to, say, economic downturn, or perhaps associated with COVID and so on. Suicide statistics are therefore widely used in research, and we've used them extensively as well, and are also the starting point for both initiating and evaluating some policy interventions. So, however, suicide statistics, even though they are formal statistics, are the product of the processes that give rise to them and generate them. And I'm going to use two transitions, problems, sudden changes in Northern Ireland statistics as a way of highlighting just how sensitive these statistics, these changes in statistics can be to changes in the processes that give rise to these statistics, and things that I wouldn't have been aware of until I saw what was happening in Northern Ireland. So here we have got suicide. These are official statistics. They come from they're produced by ONS, and they go up from 1981 all the way up to 2018. They are for the individual countries in the UK. blue for Scotland, light green for Wales, red for England, and this dashed, slightly thicker dashed line is for Northern Ireland. And you can see the trends in suicide across the UK over the last, 30 odd years. So looking, and this is for males, I'll show you the one for females in a little, on the next slide. So if you look at Northern Ireland, obviously smaller country, more stochastic variation in the rates of suicide on a year-to-year basis. But between 1981 and almost 2004, almost, 25 years, Northern Ireland has had the lowest rates of suicide in the UK. So it bounces around a bit, but overall, the lowest rates of suicide in the UK. And then something happened in 2005, and we went from the lowest to the highest. This was a dramatic increase in males increased by 66% in the space of 1 year. Females increased by almost 72%. So we went from the lowest in the course of 1 year, we changed, and then over the next 10 years, 15 years, we maintained roughly the highest levels of suicide in the UK. This is a change that is not normal, or not due to normal causes. Females, again, slightly downward trend for females, still more or less lowest rates of suicide in the UK. And then again, this transition 2005, 2006, and we're vying with Scotland for highest rates of suicide for females. But same sort of pattern again, with a 72% increase. So that's the first dramatic change. Second change occurred here. A little bit of backdrop and context for this, first of all. So here again, more recent suicides in Northern Ireland divided into the total suicides, and those that are definitive or definite suicides, those that are defined as being self-inflicted, and those that are of undetermined intent. And of the undetermined intent, the percentage that are drug-related. And you can see that it has, the numbers of suicide in Northern Ireland has been generally edging upwards a little bit over this period of time. But the percentage of the undetermined has been increasing most markedly. A lot of the excess deaths here, or higher levels of deaths here, are being due to those deaths which are coded as undetermined intent. And of those, a very large proportion of them are related to drug overdoses. Transition 2. However, deaths in 2019, you can see the undetermined deaths, which had been ticking over about over 100, 140, 30 here. In 2019, the proportion of deaths which were undetermined went to 17, a drop of over 100, with the result that self-inflicted deaths remain more or less the same, but the overall suicide rates also dropped by 100, i.e. by roughly a third or 30%. So a massive change. And again, a change that is not natural. So what has happened here is that this massive drop here has cast a shadow over these deaths here, but I'll talk about that in a little while. So this is what this might look like. So I'm just going to go back a slide here. So this has now cast a review of suicides from 2015 onwards. 2019 are thought to be of high quality. There's a question mark over the coding of deaths of suicides in Northern Ireland from 2015 to 18 inclusive. But if this 30% drop is maintained, then this is what our suicide rates might look like in those latter years. So again, now vying for middle averaging rates across the UK. So to recap, for this is for males, age standardized suicide rates for males across the UK. This is what it might look like. 25 years worth of the lowest levels of suicide in Northern Ireland, a change in 1 year, jumping to the highest levels of suicide in the UK, which was maintained for about 10 years. And then if this review goes the way we're expecting it, we will now drop to averaging levels of suicide in the UK. I can tell that these changes are not related to any changes in underlying mental health in Northern Ireland. So to understand what's going on, we have to. I had to remind myself of the underlying processes whereby these statistics came about, and I'm doing this not to. I mean, I'm sure most people here know exactly how this happens, but it's just to reiterate that it's showing up my own ignorance in how these were produced, and that's why I think, well, we need to pay more attention to the processes generating the statistics. So to recap, if someone dies from natural causes, then that's very easy. Your doctor or GP or the hospital doctor fills out the death certificate, which goes to the coder. The coder is in ONS, if in England, National Records in Scotland, and NISRA, the General Registrar's Office in NISRA in Northern Ireland. This is generally thought to be the way suicides are coded in the UK. Apologies to those from Scotland. Scotland has its own way of doing things with a procurator fiscal and so on. I can't quite get the head around that, but it is significantly different. But generally, if a death is unnatural or unexpected, that goes to the coroner. The coroner then requests other information from the family, from the medical practitioner, and anybody else that knows or has detailed information about the state and condition and circumstances for the person who has died. Coroner also asks for an autopsy to be done, and all of that information is brought together at an inquest, a public inquest, in which case the coroner then gives his or her verdict, which is usually of the nature of either natural causes, accidental death, suicide, or an open verdict, and plus or minus sometimes a narrative form. And then that goes off to ONS, Office for National Statistics, or NISRA, and that's where the coding of the ICD-10 coding gets added, where which we as researchers use. At least that's what I thought was happening, but of course that's not what was going on in Northern Ireland. Unnatural, unexpected deaths in Northern Ireland. Yes, there's a coroner involved. Coroner requests further information and asks for an autopsy or PM. But there is, by and large, no inquests in Northern Ireland. And all the decision making takes place inside the coroner's office. And instead of producing a short form report, the computer system in the coroner's office produces what's called study categories, like drowning, suicide, homicide, accidental, determined, undetermined, and so on, right? And then usually there's a narrative verdict that goes with that. And that then goes to the coder, which is the General Registrar's Office in Northern Ireland. Here's the coding, which is fine, pretty standard. This is intentional self-harm. These are deaths where of undetermined intent. But note that Northern Ireland includes the late effects of intentional self-harm, but this is not the case for England or Wales. I'm not sure about Scotland. And we also include the late effects of other events of undetermined intent. But again, that's not the case in England or Wales. I include accidental poisoning here because that would be pertinent later on, because poisoning, again, can turn up in here, or here as well. Northern Ireland also includes in its official statistics deaths of residents, of people who are not resident in Northern Ireland for some strange reason. So, on one hand, we can use statistics which are based on suicides only, definitive suicides, those who are definitely due, deaths are definitely due to self-harm, intentional self-harm. But the problem with that is that they're very selective, very sensitive, very clear. but they're very selective. But they will give a very definite underestimate of the totality of the deaths due to suicide. And they're therefore low sensitivity, a type 2 error, missing out people who should be included in those numbers. These low numbers themselves will be a problem for both for researchers and your ability to say anything with any certainty. But they can also then give rise to policy inertia. If people think that, oh, well, we have a relatively small rate of suicide in our part of the world, therefore we don't need to do much about it. If, on the other hand, we include in both intentional self-harm and deaths due to undetermined intent, which has been the case since '68, then yes, we have more sensitivity. It's thought that this is better because there's less sensitivity to bias due to stigma, as some of these deaths will be maybe for sensitivity reasons classed as undetermined intent. More events, more analysis probability or possible, but again, you're offsetting sensitivity with specificity, and you've got a greater chance of including people who maybe are classifying as suicides when they maybe are not. So, putting this all together, what happened in Northern Ireland? This is a timeline for Northern Ireland events. So before the big change happened in 2005, prior to 2005, there were 7 coroners' offices, mostly run by part-time coroners. 2005, this was all rolled up. All of those offices, individual offices, were decommissioned, and they were centralised in one office in Belfast. And at that time, there was 1 coroner. There's now 4. So centralised in Belfast, but they had a new computer system installed, which produced study categories. New computer system, but unfortunately, this computer system did not differentiate between poisonings that were deaths due to poisoning, which were accidental causes, and those that were due to undetermined intent. They just classified them as drugs-related deaths. However, that wasn't a problem, because there was the information that went to NISRA, and the coder in NISRA would ring up the coroner's office and have a chat. Note, it was one coder in NISRA who was doing all the work, and she would ring up the people who produced from the coroner's office, have a chat, and between them, they would settle on the correct coding, whether it was accidental or an undetermined intent death. 2015, tragedy. The NISRA coder retires. The coding then moves to ONS. It's not done now in NISRA. It's now moves to ONS, and that's for 2 reasons. One, for greater efficiency and so on. But secondly, because it now means that coding in Northern Ireland is more closely aligned to ONS, except it's not really, as we'll see. However, once this coder retires, this conversation between coroner's office and the coding stopped. ONS are now just getting the drug-related deaths, and ONS now classify these as undetermined intent, which is possibly why our undetermined intent deaths have been going up. 2019, the computer system gets updated, and there is more differentiation within the system, and instead of just having drugs-related deaths, the new computer system in the coroner's office differentiates between undetermined deaths and accidental deaths due to poisoning. And this then goes off to ONS, and the coding is now thought to be, that we have officially produced in Northern Ireland, is now thought to be correct. Moving on, the very poor state of Northern Ireland's mental health has, of course, been bubbling along in the press and the media and amongst our elected representatives. And in 2020, new Minister of Health comes in, championing mental health, and indeed actually elects or puts in place a mental health champion for Northern Ireland to help solve our poor mental health problem. That was followed quickly in the same year by an action plan and a mental health strategy. However, at the same time, it was apparent that all the way throughout the UK, there have been an increasing number of deaths due to drugs, and especially in Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland. And that prompted a review of drug-related deaths in Northern Ireland and the possible glitch in our coding of drug-related deaths in from 2015 to 2019 came to light. And we're now having a review of the deaths from 2015 to 2018 onwards. Consequences. Our numbers of suicides, both definite self-harm and undetermined intent, will fall. I think also that what we think we know about suicide will also change, because we previously have been including too many accidental poisonings, and that will have changed the age, sex, geographical distribution of those deaths. It has really made trend analysis very difficult, and I suspect in Northside Northern Ireland we will not be able to say anything about possible impacts of COVID on suicide. Will it have an impact on policy? Possibly. I don't think our mental health champion is suggesting that she affected this change, but you might suggest that a shift will go from mental health and to more an emphasis on drug-related deaths. So, lessons learned. Producing statistics on suicides is inherently very difficult. What surprised me about these is that I thought suicides were going to be the foundation, the building blocks upon which we put a lot of policy and understanding of mental health. These are all official statistics. They involve significant legal processes, and they're all apparently done to WHO standards. That's all throughout the UK. And they're obviously significant problems with them. It emphasizes again that even though we're talking about suicides here, this applies, I'm sure, to all of the data we use in relating to mental health and indeed any other study of disease. Look first at the data before we get too entrenched in the science. Otherwise, we're building very fancy houses on very shaky foundations. And to do that, you have to know the processes behind the data, the processes that generate the data. And especially with administrative data, keep a very cynical eye out and perhaps triangulate wherever possible so that we can have further study of the accuracy and validity of the measures we use. And finally, although this story relates to Northern Ireland, I suspect the message is applicable right across the UK, not just to suicide statistics, but also to other measures of mental health that we're using today. So again, thank you for your patience on that. Any questions I will take now before we hand over to the next speaker.
Why are males more likely to commit? So it relates to one particular aspect of your presentation right at the very beginning, and it's just asking the question: why are males more likely to commit suicide, and does it perhaps have something to do with them being less open to speaking out?
Probably. The answer, I think, men. It's the risk factors for poor mental health are not the same as those for actually taking your life, or from moving from suicide ideation to suicide fact. And I think that men are much more impulsive. Women are much more willing to share and to tell other people and to go and get treatment for their poor mental health. Men are not. Also, perhaps men have got more ready access to the means of suicide as well. I don't know if that answers your question, Andrew.
It was Eileen's question, but I'm just...
yes, there's another question here from Anne. I'm just looking at my... asking, was Northern Ireland affected by the changes in the burden of proof? Yes, it was. That came in at pretty much the same time as England and Wales did. However, I think that came in 2018, maybe. But because we're now going to have this review, I think they're actually going to backdate the burden of proof because they're reviewing the coroner's cases, and they're going to backdate that to 2015. Dermot, suicide, probable suicide, and possible help reclassification. I don't understand. Anne, if you can clarify that question.
So I guess when we look at suicide stats, there's the definite suicides that you talked about. There's the probable ones, which are the suicides and undetermined. And then there's possible, which are things like the poisoning codes you referred to, the single vehicle collisions. And I guess I wonder whether some of the issues that you're talking about, the differences in coding, you know, we tend to, you're talking about official stats, but when we do our studies, we tend to do sort of sensitivity analyses around all those different sorts of codes.
So, yes, I agree. But I'm not sure that possible is an official code.
It's not, but it includes some of the things that seem to be included in Northern Ireland stats that we don't include in our official stats.
So, I mean, it is tricky. I mean, if someone dies of a drug overdose, it's very hard to determine in retrospect what was going on, what the person's intent was. And indeed, the same can be true if somebody is found in a river from a drowning or even a single vehicle crash. Hard to know. And that's inherently difficult with suicide statistics. I think for me is that you're right. You have to recognize the uncertainty within the data, and you have to build sensitivities around. So we oftentimes now what we do is we just look at suicides where definite self-harm has been the coding, and we're pretty sure that that is correct. We know that that's an undercount, and we know that we'll be less robust when we in our statistics. But if we're getting the same patterns, then that's more reassuring. And then we add in, say, maybe the undetermined intents. What you do about poisonings, it's increasingly difficult to know what to do with those. And I don't know, where would you put them? If you're in Wales and people with accidental poisonings, how do you handle those in your suicide analysis and statistics?
So we will often code around, so for possibles, we'll often code around age and things, you know, so lots of the accidental will be younger people. So they're always over 10, and we have it as possible. So my experience when we look at lots of cases, we've gone through sort of doing much more psychological autopsy type work, is that definitely from the, you know, when we had sort of a criminal burden of proof, suicide codes were underestimated hugely. You know, partly to do with families being in coroner's courts and the stigma associated with it.
What occurs to me as well is, I mean, I agree. Sorry, if you've got the facility and the time and the resources to dig a little more deeply into each case, maybe look at their past history in terms of, did they have any poor mental health issues on medication, did they have any self-harm history and so on as well, and perhaps even get their coroner's notes or anything else that was collected at the time. That's obviously a good thing to do, but in general, you don't have those, the latitude to do that or the resources to do that. You have to use the official statistics as best they are. What occurs to me is that there's still a fair bit of latitude in what happens in the coroner's office. And I'm not entirely, I mean, you see this in Northern Ireland because we have only a small number of coroners, and therefore a small change in attitudes and behaviors or how they wish to put things or present things, it's more apparent. But I suspect the same is true right across the UK.
Absolutely, and I think your final point is the important point, and it's across the board. It's not just in suicide data. Is understanding where it's coming from, because the size of the data sets we work with, it's really easy to come up with positive findings.
Yes.
And it's understanding the foundations your house is built on, isn't it?
I think that's it. I think that's